I'm really looking forward to this conversation today, Geoffrey, because over the past number of years, and in fact, you and I have met several years ago in Brussels, several times actually. And I've been focused on transatlantic discussions, transatlantic relationships. As we look at grand strategy, it's important to understand that strategy, as we're putting together our grand strategy, we really have to understand where our allies are in that picture, in that grand picture. And this is exactly the talk that Geoffrey is going to give today. Geoffrey Van Orden, who is a distinguished fellow at the Gold Institute, is a former soldier and a senior politician. He was the last leader of the British Conservatives in the European Parliament before Britain left the EU in January of 2020. He had been re-elected 5 times since 1999 by the British people as a member of the European Parliament, European senator. Before entering politics, he was a military intelligence officer for 30 years. His first operational posting was in Borneo in 1965 in defense of the newly formed state of Malaysia during the Confrontation War. He went on to become a counterterrorism specialist, and at the age of 27 was awarded the MBE for special duties in Northern Ireland at the height of the IRA terrorist troubles in the early 1970s. MBE is a member of the British Empire. An honor first introduced by King George V during World War I. He was subsequently promoted to be commander of the Order, CBE, for his political services. He first visited Kashmir in 1977 with the Indian Army in Sri Lanka in 1977 with the Sri Lankan Armed Forces, and Israel in 1984 with the Israeli Defense Forces. He visited all these countries. He visits all these countries regularly. Spent over 5 years in Berlin, and in 1989, before the fall of the wall, was the chief of staff to the British sector and head of the military intelligence staff. He had attended the Indian Defense Services Staff College and instructed the German General Staff College. His last military appointment was at NATO headquarters in Brussels in 1994 as a brigadier general. From the time of his first election to the European Parliament, he was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He became its vice chairman, a member of the Defense Committee, and Conservative Foreign Affairs and Defense spokesman. He was also vice chairman of the Special Committee on Terrorism. The truth is, I can continue reading, but after everything that I've told you, I think that we clearly understand that Geoffrey is supremely qualified to be speaking on the topic that we have today. So with that, without further ado, Geoffrey, the floor is yours.
Okay, Eli, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity that this seminar series actually gives us to talk about these important issues. May I, first of all, just reiterate the statement you made earlier about the death of Captain Sir Tom Moore, because indeed I did write about him, and Tom Moore became very rapidly a sort of legendary figure because he set out to raise a few £1,000s for our National Health Service, and he ended up raising £32 million. And the honours and awards just flowed forward. So he was admitted to hospital with COVID, and very sadly, at the age of 100, he died today. So Captain Sir Tom Moore. I want to say a few words on the nature of strategy, on Britain's changing place in the world and our efforts at defining national strategy, and then have a look at alliances. The London newspaper, The Times, has a short daily footnote piece called The Last Word. And last Monday, funnily enough, it was a quote from Paul Nitzer, who, of course, you will all know. He was Lyndon Johnson's Deputy Director of Defence in the late 60s, and he's best remembered as the principal author of that 1950 top secret, as it was, US strategic assessment of the Soviet Union, NSC 68, which defined American Cold War policy for decades to come. The Times quoted Nitzer as saying that one of the most dangerous forms of human error is forgetting what one is trying to achieve. So this puts in everyday terms, I think, what the military, indeed, I'd like to think all strategists, regard as the first and most important principle of war, the maintenance of the aim. Grand strategy is an assessment and plan for harnessing the resources of the nation or a group of nations to achieve that aim. Adam Loevinger put it very well yesterday when he said, how does one leverage all one's levers of power to achieve an objective? So the first priority, therefore, is to decide what it is you want to achieve. This actually is quite a complex calculation, influenced by many factors. What are you prepared to give up? Over what period do you want to try and achieve this aim? What will be the response of those opposing you? And how will you react to this response? And in our democracies, how will you keep the people on side, supportive of what you want to achieve? As this might mean hardship and an abandoning short-term, perhaps very popular initiatives. And will you have the flexibility to stay on track in spite of disruptions, distractions, and adversity? So therefore, a successful strategy requires some hard choices based on solid information and realism and pursued with competence and determination. It needs to avoid wishful thinking, group thinking, and the echo chambers of the like-minded. By the way, that's how I described the European Parliament in a speech I made there. And political partisanship needs to be avoided as well. But let's, before we go deeper into all this, let's not forget the words of two 19th century British Prime Ministers and one from the mid-20th century. Lord Salisbury, he remarked that whatever happens will be for the worse. And sometimes, therefore, it's in our interests that as little should happen as possible. Lord Palmerston reminded us that no nation has perpetual friends or enemies, only perpetual interests. And Harold Macmillan reminded us that events, dear boy, events will inevitably intrude upon the best laid plans. So let me just take a moment to look at the UK approach to strategy. It needs to be set into the context of where you are. I mean, for over 500 years, Britain was an outward-looking maritime power, and from the period of, well, really the whole of the 19th century, certainly from 1805 to 1870, the Royal Navy was the strongest maritime power in the world, and it could maintain Britain's position as a global economic, financial, and military hegemon. The strategy was simple: to maintain that position. And this
Geoffrey, can you hear me? Geoffrey, I think your computer is muted, or do you see that? Just hit unmute.
How's that?
There you go.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. Let me just arrange myself.
Just go back about 10 seconds and you'll be...
Yeah, okay. So I was talking about, did you get the quotes from the three prime ministers?
Yes. That would I would start from there, correct.
I'll go over that again. Okay.
Yes, please.
So Lord Salisbury, he remarked that whatever happens will be for the worse. And therefore it's in our interest that as little should happen as possible. Lord Palmerston reminded us that no nation has perpetual friends or perpetual enemies, only perpetual interests. And Harold Macmillan reminded us that events, dear boy, events will inevitably intrude upon the very best laid plans. So I want to have a quick look at the UK approach to strategy, putting in the context of the fact that for over 500 years, Britain was an outward-looking maritime power. For most of the 19th century, certainly from 1815 to 1870, it was the Royal Navy was the strongest maritime power in the world, able to maintain Britain's position as a global economic, financial, and military hegemon. The strategy was simple: to maintain that position. It was formalized in the late 1880s, what was known as the two-power standard, to ensure the Royal Navy would be as strong as the world's next two largest navies combined, which at that point happened to be France and Russia. By the way, we hadn't appreciated that already by that time, both Germany and the United States had overtaken us industrially, and that soon the Germans would start building a fleet to challenge the supremacy of the Royal Navy. So your strategic appreciations need to be based on some good, solid information. While globally we relied on the Royal Navy, the other part of British strategy was to maintain the centuries-old balance of power on the continent of Europe, to ensure that no one nation had such preponderance that it could threaten British security. We even came to an agreement with France in 1905. France, of course, had been a long-standing threat to British interests, and the aim was to counterbalance the rising power of Germany. But come 1914, our position was unclear. It was not certain, even then, that we would enter a war alongside France against Germany. Winding forward to June 1940 now, Churchill stood before the House of Commons, and in that famous Fight on the Beaches speech, he outlined our national strategy: to defend our island home, to ride out the storm, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, until in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. It was very simple then. Hold out as long as possible, hit the enemy where we could, and above all, get the United States engaged in the war in Europe. That was Churchill's overriding strategic objective. After the war, Britain saw itself rather contentedly sitting at the center of three overlapping circles: its relationship with the United States, its leadership of the Commonwealth, and its relationship with Western Europe. The most consequential decisions that were taken after the Second World War certainly related to what is now called the European Union. In the late 1950s, to many, Britain seemed engaged on a policy of managed decline that it hoped could be mitigated by our efforts to join what was then called the European Economic Community. So from probably the late 1960s onwards, our efforts were focused on joining the European Community as the solution to all our problems. And by the early 1970s, everything was subordinated to this objective, even the precious Commonwealth, even the future of such national assets as our aerospace industry, for example. And it was not until Margaret Thatcher's premiership in the 1980s, with the successful Falklands campaign and the renewal of economic success, that Britain began to recover her national self-confidence and to have serious doubts about the way the European bloc was developing. The most recent UK national security strategy, one of only two in the public domain, defined our objective as a secure and prosperous United Kingdom with global reach and influence. But in February of last year, the British government launched a new review, what they called the Integrated Review, an ambitious initiative which aimed to define the government's ambition for the UK's role in the world and the long-term strategic aims for our national and foreign policy. By the way, I think this has been delayed a little bit because of COVID, and obviously we need to take account of what the long-term implications of COVID have been and also the economic recovery from COVID. So we've seen all the tops and turns and changes and everything have gone on in British strategy, really from the position of Britain being a powerful and a leading nation, and then this enormous loss of national self-confidence, which gradually came back again. And certainly until COVID hit us, I think we were still feeling very self-confident as a nation. Now let me just say a word or two about military alliances, because alliances are as old as history. They provide obviously additional military resources, access to bases, and political support. They also involve wider operational responsibilities, greater complexity, and the security of decision-making is potentially weakened, depending who your allies are, of course. As Churchill famously remarked, there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them. More than that, actually, allies are sometimes found to have conflicting interests, unrelated to the purposes of the alliance, may undermine alliance solidarity. So ideally, then, any alliance should be based on agreed views about its aims and determination to contribute to the achievement of those aims. Sometimes, then, ad hoc coalitions of the willing, provide a better short-term solution to a particular problem. Immediately after the Second World War, the aim of the United States and Britain was rapid disarmament and economic recovery, but the Soviet Union had other threatening intentions. George Kennan later described how America's overarching strategy was not to provoke, attack, or conquer the communist world, rather to conduct a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive power tendencies until either the breakup or mellowing of this Soviet power. And this was given further edge, of course, in Paul Nitzer's NSC 68 National Security Strategy, which emphasized military action and rollback. Part of the theory of containing the Soviet threat was through a global network of powerful alliances. Key starting point, of course, was the Marshall Plan to help the Europeans get back on their feet. It seemed that the Americans had learned the lesson that isolationism led to insecurity and that future threats could be averted by credible deterrence backed by unambiguous commitment. We've seen the folly of going in the other directions through the things that I've described. But with all its might, even the Americans couldn't do this alone. The United States might be able to fight alone, but it needed political, moral, and other support. Britain was weakened after the world wars, but still retained far-reaching capabilities, as it does, of course, to this day. And by the late 1940s, the Soviet threat was deemed to have overtaken the German threat, and NATO was formed by, at that stage, 9 European nations, along with the United States, Canada, and Iceland. Well, I mean, it's a cliche to say that NATO is the most successful alliance in history, I suppose because it still exists, and it did effectively deter the Soviet Union. The original 12 countries have now become 30. But throughout its history, even NATO has experienced periodic crisis. Donald Trump, of course, was merely the last of a long line of American presidents who wanted the Europeans to share more of the burden. Two alliance members, Greece and Turkey, have had persistent quarrels which have come close to actual conflict. But it's the French, unsurprisingly, who've been the consistent troublemakers in their quest to remove American influence from European security. This began post-Suez, saw the withdrawal of the French from the military structures of NATO in 1966, only to return in 2009. And now we see its effects through the efforts to create a European Defence Union and EU strategic autonomy. That means something separate from the United States. And by the way, I suggest that the United States has never really understood the EU, and in particular, the invidious aspects of the European Union's defence ambitions. It's been too ready to believe soothsayers who try to project it as some sort of reinforcement of Western defence capabilities. Just over a year ago, the NATO summit in London initiated a forward-looking reflection process. Wanted to look at, how do we revitalize NATO for the coming decade? They presented their recommendations, all 138 of them, last November. And I suppose the key ones were they wanted an update of the strategic concept. They wanted to enhance NATO's role as the unique and essential transatlantic forum for consultations, dual-track deterrence and dialogue with Russia, address the security challenges of China, including implications of its technological developments, and collaborate to ensure that large-scale authoritarian states do not achieve dominance in emerging disruptive technologies. And they also wanted to integrate the fight against terrorism into NATO's core tasks. Whether any of this will weather the members of the North Atlantic Council remains to be seen, but certainly Secretary General intends to draw on these recommendations and bring them together in the NATO summit, which will take place later this year. I'm sure there will be certain countries like France and Germany sitting around that table that will demand even more recognition for the European Union, which would be very invidious in my mind. Well, it's not just Europe that's been an issue, an alliance issue, but also the Far East and indeed the Middle East. Look at the Middle East, first of all. Let's not forget, I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment about new, sort of Middle East NATO and creating new alliance structures there. Let's not forget, we have had alliances in the Middle East before. In 1955, there was the Baghdad Pact, which soon became what's known as CENTO, which lasted until, or staggered on almost until 1979. It involved the United Kingdom, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. The United States didn't get formally involved, although it had a seat at the table. By the way, it's worth mentioning that there was an underlying problem in the 50s between Britain, which was still the paramount power in the Middle East, and the United States, which was fully committed to combating communism, but was in full anti-colonial mood. The Americans misunderstood the nature of so-called Arab nationalism and made what many regard as America's greatest strategic blunder of those times by not merely not supporting, but actively opposing the British-French-Israeli attack on Nasser's Egypt. But we could talk at length about the implications of Suez and what the consequences of that have been. And actually, my view here is a minority one. People just say, oh, you know, the Suez disaster. Well, it was only a disaster because of the way allies treated one another. CENTO actually had no military structure. The withdrawal of Iran and then Pakistan in 1979 saw its formal demise. Before that, actually, the British Labour government had already announced its intention on economic grounds to withdraw British forces from the Far East and the Persian Gulf, and what I regard as one of the most consequential strategic errors of the British, of withdrawing from what we call east of Suez. Of course, the binding threat in the region today is Iran, but containing Iran, it was a range of regional antipathies, not least concerning the role of Turkey. Iran already embraces the Shiite populations in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, and even supports Sunni Hamas, given its active role against Israel. And Turkey displays some ambivalence in its relations with Iran, and President Erdogan's support for Muslim League extremists arouses the hostility of the Gulf monarchies, in particular the Saudis. Qatar has had a different relationship, which has created its own problems. Israel has unhelpfully prolonged its falling out with Turkey over the issue of gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean. So while there's been a lot of progress in coming together of governments in the Middle East in recent months, it's not going to be easy to stitch together a meaningful alliance that would last. Let me briefly turn to Asia, where again, we had a treaty organization, SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. That too was set up in 1955. It was all part of a containment strategy. There were 8 countries included this time were the United States and the United Kingdom. Had no military structure, much internal disagreement. Someone described it as a zoo of paper tigers. And it folded in 1977, but Pakistan had previously withdrawn. France stopped paying. It proved of little value in the Vietnam War, although it was the basis for Australian and Thai involvement in that war. The regional situation is vastly different today, due, of course, to the exponential rise of China. There are many more independent countries in the region. Japan is no longer self-effacing in defense terms, and India is firmly back in the Western camp, although I have to say Russia is still the main provider of weaponry to India. And Pakistan has become a key Chinese ally. So again, although there's a willingness, we see it with the Quad, the difficulties of stitching together a meaningful alliance that will last the course, and where outside powers will feel ready to commit, is extraordinarily difficult. So now let's come to a couple of conclusions. Well, history doesn't go away. We need to understand the past and the lessons of the past without being hypnotized by them. We make sure that national treasuries don't define national strategy, although, of course, the strength of the economy does underpin our ability to conduct elements of our national strategy. I think if we look back over some of the things that I've described, you can see that you don't have to be friends to be partners. Remember the proverb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I mean, after all, throughout the Second World War, when Stalin stopped being an ally of Hitler, he then became an ally of the forces reigned against Hitler. But that was an alliance of convenience for a particular time. We needed the Soviet Union, they needed us. We need to know who our most reliable friends are, and enduring friends, and we all need to pull our weight. And the other important thing to understand is that no country in this globalized multipolar world can go it alone. So listen to your friends and take note of their concerns and advice. And alliances are built in response to a threat. If an alliance is to work, then there has to be agreement on the threat, agreement on the aim, suppression of differences between members, determination to make it work, even in difficult times. And also, and very important in the democracies, support of our citizens. I think this is one of our big weak points. Otherwise, there has to be willingness and flexibility for ad hoc coalitions. So just as in 1940 and in 1950 and at the beginning of the 21st century, we have options. We can believe our own self-criticism and worst nightmares and give in to what we're told is inevitable. We can just react to events. We can get on the front foot and with allies actively promote and defend our freedom, our prosperity, and our values from a position of self-confidence and great strength. We need to create the security environment in which we want to operate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoffrey. That was fascinating. A question I have for you is: at what point in time did our strategies switch? And I think you touched on this, but where globally it appears that strategies switched from staying at the height of power to now staying at the height of defense. We're now looking to defend ourselves rather than to stay on power. Is it that we've changed, that the political climate has changed? And when I'm going to use President Trump as an example, when he says America first, in this context would say, we stay on the height of power, that already became politically incorrect, as we saw what happened at the United Nations. Yeah. When did that shift take place?
Well, I'm not sure it did. After all, one of the things we would always say about the Western alliances, that we weren't an aggressive, we weren't an offensive alliance. We were a defensive alliance. It was when others threatened us that we then stood together and took action, often a bit belatedly, but eventually we got round to it. And of course, these days, you don't have time. You've got to get there beforehand. So I think, and of course, let's also remember how others look at us, because they don't necessarily see us in the way that we do. I mean, I hate to say this, but for many countries, even many European countries, they see the United States as being a sort of aggressor nation. And they point, of course, always now, they point to Iraq as an example of this. I mean, Iraq, no doubt, we lost the moral high ground, and we're still suffering the consequences of that. It could have gone, of course, completely differently, but they didn't. So I think many don't see us, the West, as being this nice defensive organization or nations in the way that we'd like to see ourselves.
Excellent. Let's open it to questions. If anybody has any thoughts, Dirk, let me just let's if you would unmute yourself.
So
There you go.
I've been being unmuted. Well, Geoffrey, thank you very much for your good evening, for us at least. You gave a very good, comprehensive description of the situation where we are now. You were talking about Europe, but what about the factor of public opinion? Because designing strategies these days is not just a matter for scientists or militaries or officials. You got also public opinion in your neck. And if you look at Europe, the continent at least, if you look at Europe, two important countries, France and Germany. Now, France has a goal, which you rightly indicated. It wants to substitute, so more or less, the United States, even if it were in its imagination, as a strategic factor in Europe and beyond. But then we have Germany, and I was born very close to the German border, grew up with the German language, and know its politics fairly well. If you look at the public opinion in Germany, the last 4 years were so strongly against the United States, but in particularly President Trump, that you couldn't say one word of praise about it. It was even dangerous to do so. The media was strongly against it, whether it was the Spiegel or the Frankfurter Allgemeine or the public television. It was really very strange to see that a country or a public opinion, including many government ministers, turning against the most important ally. Now it's slightly the other way around. The woke community, which we also have somewhere, one way or the other, likes President Biden. Mrs. von der Leyen of the Commission said, we have a friend in the White House, giving a sort of a feeling of liberation to her. This is basically what you see on the left. On the right, the right was always a bit hesitant to talk about President Trump because of its unpopularity in Germany in general. But certainly the far right looks very much to Russia, wants to have a close relationship with Russia. So what we see here is the left is turning against the United States, but relatively sympathetic to Russia. The right is now more critical towards the US, but less emotional, but certainly has a preference to work also with Russia. So Russia, by Germans, has always been seen as after the Second World War, it has always been seen as a partner rather than a foe. The same we see now happening with China. So what happens is we'll see a worldview or an attitude in terms of foreign policy of equidistance. The idea is that we should keep safe distance from these bigger powers, military powers, the United States, Russia, and China. And we'll cooperate either with the one or the other. We see where the interest is, and we are more neutral. And neutralized policies are quite popular in Germany, which is, without Germany in Europe, you don't get anywhere. So that is very important. How do you see the role of public opinion and this idea, this theory of equidistance towards all our powers, but certainly not a preferential relationship with the United States?
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. Well, I agree with the point that you're making, that public opinion, and in particular the opinions of younger people, is enormously important. And in many ways, we've lost that battle. Why is that? That's really the question, I think. Well, first of all, our people, fortunately, and this was the aim of policy, of course, have been sheltered from conflict in our country, certainly in Western Europe, and to a large extent, certainly in the United States until 9/11. So there was a lot of complacency, and there was a lot of reluctance, therefore, to invest in military or military alliances. And then for those same young people in particular, they saw the investment in the military leading to military adventurism. And of course, it comes back again, and we can't get away from it, to Iraq. And so there's a reluctance to see the necessity of our strategic posture and our investment in defense. And it is one of our greatest weaknesses. I think also we have what I call the CNN factor. As soon as there is some sort of problem or difficulty in some part of the world, this is brought straight into people's sitting rooms or drawing rooms with no real explanation, and a demand then for action of maybe of a humanitarian kind. This bred, of course, that whole business of humanitarian interventionism, which became very popular about a decade or so ago. As far as Germany is concerned, well, of course, the great aim of Soviet policy was to neutralize Germany and to separate Europe from the United States. These were the big strategic aims of the Soviet Union. Well, I'm not saying the Soviet Union has done this single-handed, but certainly I would characterize the Germans now as really a sort of pacifist nation. Constitutionally, of course, they have constraints about involvement in overseas operations. And there's a great reluctance among the German citizenry to, in any way, support the military. The military is very unpopular. I mean, as you know, I taught at the German General Staff College in Hamburg. I can remember going to a dinner party in Hamburg where the woman next to me at the table, who was an editor of a German newspaper, asked me what I did. And I said I was an army officer. And she sort of reacted in horror. And then she said to me, "Oh, no, but of course you are a British army officer. You're not in our Bundeswehr, are you?" And I said, "Well, no, absolutely." And then I did go on to say to her, "By the way, have you ever met a Bundeswehr officer?" And she said, "Oh, no, I haven't." I said, "Well, why do you take such a strident position against your Bundeswehr? You've never met any of them." So that's what you were up against there. I think also we've added to this by what I would call our self-flagellation. We are all very good at arguing among ourselves, talking about our weaknesses, criticizing our governments, all of these sorts of things. So when now on top of this, you get through social media, fake news being fed in from external sources as well, we've got a real problem. So I would say, yes, Dirk-Jan, you're absolutely right. A key to our strategic success has got to be to win back public opinion and get public opinion on side in support of the necessities of security strategy.
Ken Abramowitz.
Yes, I have a question for you. Do the people, either the government in England or the EU, or the people in England or the EU, understand the existential threat from a Biden administration to Europe?
Well, I understand where you're coming from.
By the way, I'm going to give you a hint.
If I'm strictly honest, I would say most people are breathing a sigh of relief at the moment. I'm very well aware that President Trump was regarded differently by half the United States population to how he was regarded in many other parts of the world. He might have been very popular in Israel, but in Western Europe, and I think also, I'm sorry to say, in the United Kingdom, yeah, he provoked very negative feelings. We're not used to a United States president behaving in the way that he did. It was his style of presidency, the way he went about things, the way he spoke, all these things. It was intolerable. Now, of course, come the elections last year in the United States, many of us said, yes, well, okay, there were some distasteful aspects to the Trump government, but I wonder if he wouldn't be a better friend to the United Kingdom, for example, than a Biden administration. I'm pleased to say that all the signs are at the moment that President Biden actually, in spite of some of his, his personal sort of sentimental beliefs, like the Irish and all these sorts of things, in spite of that, actually, he seems to be taking a very sensible view, and he seems to be very conscious of the necessity of having a strong relationship, particularly with the United Kingdom. I, of course, hold no truck for the European Union, but it is also important that we all get on well with the continental European nations, most of which have decided to sort of bind together in this European Union. So, yeah, I think we've got to be very careful how we characterize how people view Trump versus Biden.
Larry Cunningham, you have to unmute yourself, please.
Yes, Geoffrey, thank you for the enlightening sort of global perspective. I have something a little bit more specific. I know you broached a little bit, but can you speak to the changing relationship with the United States and China, specifically under the Biden administration, and a little bit more than that, how it affects our relationship with the global perspective? And according to some in our media, as I'm sure you're aware, China is emboldened now, but that's media talking. I need more. I'd like to hear more specifics. It appears in general the right is expressing concern about their emerging power, and the left appears to be overlooking key issues. It's my view. Is the world becoming more vulnerable at this moment? Is this true in your view, or is this exaggerated? What are we missing?
Yeah. Well, I think most observers, wherever they are on the political spectrum, I mean, obviously there are some dyed-in-the-wool fans of China, but leaving that on one side, I think everyone realizes the growing power of China, the inevitable power of China, and the need, therefore, for us to devise a relationship that is realistic. Now, just as at NATO, when they look at future relations with Russia, they're talking about a dual-track approach. I think that's exactly the approach we're going to need with China. In other words, we talk. There are some things we're going to have to do together, but at the same time, we have our eyes open. We're very cautious, and we need to have a military resolve and push back against Chinese advances against our friends and allies. So, I mean, if you look at some of the big problems, I mean, I didn't touch, of course, on things like climate change and all of that, or indeed fighting pandemics. We're going to have China on board to deal with these problems. I mean, China is the world's biggest polluter at the moment. So, if we're going to make positive steps to mitigate the effects of climate change, then we're going to need China on board. And similarly, China was probably the origin of this COVID pandemic. There will be other diseases in the future. We're going to need Chinese cooperation in dealing with these problems. So I don't think most people sitting in seats of power are in any way naive about China. The other thing, by the way, I would mention is what I would call the real dilemma for many of our governments, and that is that China's spreading a lot of money around, and there are a lot of governments and that need money. They need infrastructure. They need all these sorts of things, and China is often offering assistance. I mean, after all, she's bought ports in Greece. She's building, railways between Italy and Europe. I mean, there are all sorts of things like this, and leaving out her impact on continents like Africa and her regional impact, influence with countries like Pakistan. So, a lot of the world wants to do business with China. Volkswagen's biggest car market is China. But the United States does as well. The United States wants to trade with China. So this is the dilemma, I think. But we just need to eat with a long spoon when we're dealing with China.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rob,
That was good. Thank you.
Rob, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, I have also a question. Thank you, Geoffrey, for your
Hi, Rob.
for your explanation. Yes, I have a question, and it's all about it's also about the public opinion. If we go back to the Iraq War, the public opinion was created by weapons of mass destruction, which were never found, and I think the intelligence services knew in front. I'm not sure, but that's my own opinion about that. Because of that, there was a war started, and a second one, but it destabilized the situation in the Middle East. Iran became, because Iraq was weakened, Iran became the strong power in that region. If you look back on that situation, 20 years after that, what can we learn from that situation? Was that a wise decision? Should we do it again? Or with the knowledge from now, we should have done it in a different way? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, all of that. The fact is, we got our fingers burned over Iraq. It didn't work out how people hoped it would. First of all, on your point about weapons of mass destruction. Well, I mean, I was on the assessment staff in London in the early 90s. And at that time, Saddam certainly had a very active weapons program. And he was procuring the elements that he needed from across Europe for that weapons program. And then if you wind on a few years then, so there was, if you like, a readiness to believe that this person, we know he tried to acquire the materials for making nuclear weapons and other weapons, strategic weapons. So it was easy to believe that he would continue with that process. Actually, the intelligence services thought he had WMD. One of the reasons why, I mean, I think Blair, the British Blair government has been a disaster for the United Kingdom in so many ways, which I won't go into here. But on the question of Iraq, I've never taken the view that he deliberately misled the British people. That's one thing where, you know, because I know the advice that he received. There was a conviction, both in Britain and in the United States, that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And it was a question of maybe they weren't weaponized, but the stuff was there. It was a question of finding it. I would also say maybe Saddam himself thought he had these weapons. Because after all, he'd been working on them for years. And who was going to dare turn around to him and say, well, no, actually, oh, Lord and Master, we haven't got anything. So that would have been a risk. So just on the WMD thing, I think you know, the issue was we thought he did have, and that wasn't a made up story. We were wrong, but would we do it again? Did we do it in the wrong? Well, obviously we did it in the wrong way because it worked out disastrously. You see, the benign strategic appreciation was not only would this remove a dictator and liberate the Iraqi people, and the Iraqi people would welcome us with open arms, it would also remove a supporter of terrorism and suicide bombers. It would also encourage other countries in the Middle East to improve their relationship with Israel. And that overall, if you remove someone like Saddam, this would actually free up and unfreeze the Middle East and allow a lot of benign development to take place. That was the estimation, but of course that wasn't right, and people lived in fear, and they, you know, then I remember the Turks, by the way. You see, the Turks warned us against action against Saddam. They said if you remove Saddam, Iraq will break up into its different parts, and this will not be to the advantage of any of us. And I think they were absolutely right. You know, I know we have friends and colleagues here who are very supportive of the Kurds, but the Kurdish problem is an issue which is very divisive. But more than that, you know, it was going to create a lot of problems. We now see the Shiites of Iraq really under the thumb of Iran. So far from ameliorating the situation in that part of the world, we removed actually on both flanks, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we removed the main enemies to Iran. That was another effect of what we did. So, you know, in every aspect, the whole thing was turned out as bad news. There's very little good that one can say about what came out of that whole operation. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really my view on it. So, and then of course we had all these dreadful pictures of mistreatment of prisoners and things like that, and we lost the moral high ground. I think this actually was, in a way, one of the most important consequences from the Iraq operation, and that was that we had invaded another country without good reason, whereas we'd always said we were the country that protects you from invasion by aggressors. And at the same time, we were not true to these values which we said we espoused, which was about human dignity and human rights and not torturing people and all these sorts of things, because we had these awful pictures coming out of Abu Ghraib and places like this that were showing individuals behaving. It wasn't systemic, by the way. It was individuals, but behaving in this terrible way. So these are I'm afraid, the lasting impressions. And this, when particularly younger people, when they talk about the Iraq, well, this is what they see. So, yeah, so it's meant that we've been very reluctant to engage subsequently. Some would say we're not quite reluctant enough, because you then get on to things like the Libya conflict and whether that was advisable or not. Well, that gets you into a whole different area.
Adam, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have one little insider's anecdote, and then a question for you, Geoffrey. So during the Bush administration, the Pentagon was really the sort of the intellectual and strategic center of the U.S. government, and by contrast, in the Trump administration, it was a backwater. My first job
was the State Department.
Yes, the State Department, exactly, in the Trump administration. My first job was in an Iraq operations office that Paul Wolfowitz had set up. And one of the sort of the agonizing discussions that we had was why the Bush administration decided to pin our entry into Iraq on the weapons of mass destruction issue. And specifically, I would say the dominant conversation in the White House and in the Pentagon in the lead up to entering Iraq was that after September 11th, America's tolerance for bad actors went down. We had tolerated Saddam Hussein's bad actions for quite a long time. And September 11th was a wake-up call. It's like, this was bad. It could have been worse. And so our tolerance went down. And so it wasn't, maybe the talking point was weapons of mass destruction, but that was not the dominant conversation. The dominant conversation was enough of this nonsense. We're going to make an example of Iraq to show these other bad actors, this is what's going to happen to you. And Iraq was, in many respects, it was the lowest hanging fruit because it had been violating the no-fly zones. And it was, and certainly it was part of the radical Islamist, terror network. So, I supported the liberation of Iraq from Saddam Hussein, on those grounds. The great surprise is that we had no strategy. That was the absolutely extraordinary thing. So anyhow, that aside, Geoffrey, I'm genuinely interested in your opinion. I don't know the answer to the question I'm about to ask you. How is it that, for example, NATO is a defensive alliance. It's a defensive alliance. How is it that in an age when Americans and Europeans are less sort of focused on international affairs and alliances, more focused on their economic situation, educating their children, and all the concerns that we have domestically, how is it that we make an alliance like NATO, a defensive alliance, compelling enough so that there is popular support? When I entered the NSC, I genuinely understood and had some sympathy for Trump's questioning a lot of our alliances. Where's the value proposition here? And part of the work that I did on collaborative net assessment with India, and we were going to do it with some other partners as well. I did some of it with Germany. I did some with the Israelis, some with the UK actually, was to demonstrate to our populations, to our citizens of our democracies, that these alliances are active and valuable. So this is my question: how is it? How do we build the popular support for our alliances, is my question.
Yeah. Well, the short answer to that, if I knew the answer to that, I might be a wise man. It's a thing we've got to work on. But just to address some of the points that you made, 9/11. Well, of course, it woke the United States up to the nature of terrorism. By the way, I had enormous problems with every American agency guy that I met, talking to them about Northern Ireland and the IRA. And when I told them that this IRA terrorist organization relied substantially on American financial support and moral and political support, not from the government, but from US citizens, they were sort of shocked and bemused to hear this. They didn't really get it, actually. And I think we saw a change of attitude by the United States after 9/11. I think penny dropped about terrorism. On that point as well, I think you see Blair's nightmare, I'm sure. I think he really had nightmares about the nexus between terrorists and WMD. I think that was the real concern, that there was a feeling that someone like Saddam was so rogue that there he was building WMD, and he would think nothing of passing these into the hands of people that were prepared to use them in some way or other. So I think that this was a big underlying concern. Of course, an alliance becomes compelling when there is a tangible threat. And, as I suggested, I think part of the problem is that, of course, our citizens, although they turn on their televisions and see all these nasty things going on around the world, COVID apart, they live in comfort and peace, and they haven't been called upon to do military service, and they don't really get it. What's spending all these billions on all this stuff when you could be spending it on sort of nice, friendly things. So it's very, very difficult when there is not a tangible threat. Now, maybe on the back of COVID, you see, this has brought home the nature of, if you like, existential threat, pandemic, the ease with which something like this can spread. And I think there will be a greater public appetite for measures to give greater resilience to our societies, and look at ways in which we can better protect ourselves. And I think better protecting ourselves goes beyond mere disease. It goes into other fields as well. So maybe for all the sort of horrors of COVID, on the back of that, maybe there's an opportunity to make a more compelling case for our strategic commitments. And by the way, just to underline really what you're saying here, I mean, the fact is, for a lot of people, you see, NATO is seen as the United States. That's how a lot of European laymen see NATO. I mean, the fact that, 27 of the 30 NATO members now are European countries. And the other three are, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. But of course, it's the overwhelming power of the United States, which is the key element of NATO, and that's what those that support NATO want. And if you don't like the United States, it's the reason you don't like NATO. So it's all wrapped up with attitudes to the United States. And by the way, even now, and whenever you hear, certainly over here, public broadcasts about the Cold War and all the rest of it, it's almost a sort of cliche. Oh, the Cold War, what the hell was that? Oh, the Cold War, yeah, that was a sort of standoff between the Americans and the Russians. You know, no one turned around and said, no, it wasn't. It was the free world prepared to defend itself against Soviet communism and destroying our way of life and our prosperity. And I loved it, you know. But no, it was just some nasty, it was just some standoff between the Americans and the Russians. That's how people do it. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I don't know where we start, really. But you see, don't forget, in the 50s and 60s, we had a very active information campaigns. People are a bit more maybe sophisticated or skeptical or cynical these days. So it would have to be different. But I think we need to fight back in terms of information. You know, we need to expose the activities of our potential enemies and their hostile activities, particularly when they're working within our own countries. Yeah.
You know, Geoffrey, you mentioned that the general public sees NATO as the United States. Maybe the problem is that government also sees NATO as the United States. If our allies, our NATO allies, looked and took more ownership, which is possibly what President Trump was suggesting when he asked everybody.
Yeah, no, well, as you know, I mean, I've observed, Eli, that you know, one of the things that President Trump achieved was that you know, he insisted that European allies should share more of the burden and that they should pay up, pay their way. That was certainly true.
But I would add that is France's idea of a European military or a European defense system, is that their way of taking ownership of this and thereby, for lack of better terms, neutering or destroying? I don't know how, to what extent, and that maybe you can tell me, that defense alliance with the United States.
Well, in their hearts, and certainly in the French military, they value the alliance with the United States. But the problem lies politically in the sort of grand strategy of France, if you like. Somewhere in the deep cells of the Élysée Palace and the Quai d'Orsay, the foreign ministry in Paris, there is a persistent cell at work which seeks to create a Europe where France is the natural leader and where United States influence is removed. I mean, I would say this goes back to, I mean, you know, my view is this goes back to de Gaulle, to his experiences in the Second World War. Read de Gaulle's diaries, fascinating. You know, you'd imagine that every effort, every focus would be on defeating the Nazis. No, it wasn't. It was these les Anglo-Saxons who were trying to undermine the French Empire and French la gloire de la France. I mean, they had a problem. And then, of course, when de Gaulle came back into power in the late 50s, this became a serious problem again. He was determined that France should, and particularly after the Suez catastrophe, really, because, and I blame America for that, blame America completely for that. And we could have a separate discussion on the consequences of Suez, just as we're talking about the consequences of Iraq today. Even Eisenhower, by the way, apparently in conversation with Nixon, said that he thought he'd made a mistake over Suez and the way he treated the Brits and the French and indeed the Israelis. And certainly Kissinger regarded the attitude to the Suez campaign as America's greatest strategic error at that time. So, yeah, so, but you see, after Suez, the British and the French drew different conclusions. The French concluded you can't trust the Americans, therefore we need to go our own way. And the British concluded, look, we need the Americans. We must never get ourselves out of step with them again. We must make sure we're always in lockstep with the Americans. That doesn't mean we do what they say. It does mean that they have full confidence in us and we in them, and we're telling one another what we're up to. That and so that was the parting of the ways, and it's gone on from there. Yes, there's a determined. What else does strategic autonomy mean in the European Union, other than you just have to say autonomy from what? Well, from the United States.
Right.
They're prepared, by the way, to do business with the Russians, even involve, even hire, Russian aircraft and what have you for their military little expeditions, all these sorts of things. They're prepared to do all that, get involve the Chinese in their satellite programs and things like that. Yeah, they're prepared to do things like that, but it's the United States that is the problem. In spite of the fact, when the chips are down, they want to know the United States is still there. So
right.
that's the irony of it.
Right. So I thank you very much. I think that Ernie, do you have a question?
Yeah, real quick comment. Yeah, I agree with you, Geoffrey, and your earlier comment on the European defense autonomy. But we can look at a little history here. Think back to the European Rapid Reaction Force, as I recall. I don't know, lasted from the mid-90s to early, maybe 2010, 2011 or 12. So what was that? What was that? In the end, it was just a headquarters and a commitment to field up to a division or so of light infantry troops. The reality is a light.
Yeah. Well,
I'll speak from a military perspective here. That's nothing. It's the least lethal. It's the least mobile, and it's the least survivable element on the battlefield. So it's really a little military effect. But there has to be some other reason, and I think, and you hit on that, autonomy from the United States.
It was political.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, all my time, 20 years in the European Parliament, I was leading the opposition to all of this nonsense that was coming out of the European Union on defense. The trouble is, you see, in our democracies, you can have a change of regime and you suddenly find the certainties of one moment are no longer certainties. So I remember in the Maastricht Treaty, which was a very critical European Union treaty, which effectively created the European Union and much more. Saying to the British, I'm surprised, to British ministers at the time, I said, I'm surprised you allowed that language about the ambition to create a common European defense. And I remember them saying to me at the time, oh, Geoffrey, it doesn't matter. It's not going to happen. It'll never happen. And if they try and do it, we'll just block it. And so that'll be the end of that. And then, hey presto, 5 years later, Tony Blair is now Prime Minister. And one of the first things he does is trips over the English Channel to France, meets President Chirac in Saint-Malo, and agree that the European Union should have its own military capability, separate from NATO, a self-standing military capability. So, and then, of course, Blair persuaded the United States that this was all harmless, because he said, don't worry, I'm in charge. I'm a good friend of the United States. and I'll make sure this all stays on course, and it'll all be helpful to NATO and all the rest of it. And the Americans believe this. So they changed their attitude. So at one moment, I remember many American officials and that I spoke to those years ago wouldn't hear of any European Union involvement in defense. And then suddenly they became tolerant of this. And I kept saying to the Americans, and their answer always was, provided the Europeans come up with more military capability, how they achieve this is the Europeans' own business and their responsibility. And I said, that's not good enough. You must influence what they're doing. But they wouldn't hear of this. And that was my consistent theme whenever I talked to Americans at that time.
Well, thank you, Geoffrey, for your talk today. Fascinating as always. And as you know, this is clearly is something that you and I have spent many hours talking about. So I thank everybody for joining us, and I look forward to tomorrow. General Adino will be speaking to us regarding a grand strategy and its role within military engagement. So with that, I thank everybody, and I look forward to tomorrow.
Will you help support our important work?
The Gold Institute for International Strategy needs your financial support.
Please consider making your generous contribution today.